"If you didn't exist, everything would have been better," my father often said. My father, Edward Hartwell, spat those words out with the kind of casual cruelty that only comes from decades of practice, and I didn't even flinch. I am Lena Hartwell. I am 33 years old now, but whenever I stand in this massive house, I feel exactly like that helpless little girl they all decided to hate so long ago. My father is a highly successful businessman, a man who values complete control, financial dominance, and public image above absolutely everything else. Sitting silently next to him is my mother, Margaret Hartwell, a fiercely controlling woman who treats our lives like a high-stakes chessboard where she dictates every single move. And then there is Clara, my younger sister. Clara is the golden child, the one who never makes a mistake, never steps out of line, and is perfectly matched with her husband, Victor Lang. Victor is an ambitious, smooth-talking, and rapidly rising politician who fits effortlessly into my family's obsession with maintaining a flawless public image that I and the Hartwell household. There is an unspoken but universally accepted truth that hangs heavy in the air every single day. Everyone believes that I am the person who destroyed our family. This wasn't a sudden realization they came to. It was a deliberate, damaging narrative built over a lifetime of finger-pointing. Ever since I was a small child playing in these quiet hallways, every single argument that echoed through the house was somehow blamed entirely on me. Every business failure my father faced, every minor household inconvenience, every bad mood was automatically my fault. If anything terrible ever happened, the immediate, reflexive response from my parents was always exactly the same. Lena caused trouble again. The true origin of this suffocating, endless hatred goes back exactly 25 years, to a horrific, chaotic night when a massive fire broke out in the Hartwell family home. The consequences of that terrifying night were absolutely devastating for us. Our family company, which my father had built his entire identity and ego around, was pushed to the absolute brink of bankruptcy. The family's previously flawless reputation was severely damaged in the eyes of the unforgiving public and their wealthy peers. Worse still, one of our relatives was badly injured in the blaze, leaving a permanent physical reminder to match the emotional scars. The family desperately needed a reason for all the suffering, a convenient scapegoat to bear the weight of the tragedy, and they found one in me. The entire family firmly, without a shadow of a doubt, believed that I, a mere 8-year-old child at the time, was the one who caused the fire because of that unquestioned, deeply ingrained belief. My life for the past 25 years has been a waking nightmare. I have been treated entirely like a pariah, a destructive force in human form wandering their pristine halls. They treated me as the bad seed, the child who brought unspeakable shame and embarrassment to the proud family name. I was repeatedly labeled a stain on their perfect, wealthy existence. But the most twisted, psychological part of my lifelong punishment was that they never actually forced me to leave the house. They kept me right there, living under their roof, eating at their table, breathing their air. I eventually realized that they kept me around as a living, breathing reminder of failure, a convenient, quiet target for all their unresolved anger and bitterness over what they had lost. And I grew up in the shadow of immense privilege, surrounded by ridiculous money and luxury, but I was entirely invisible to the people who were supposed to love and protect me. No one in the house trusted me with even the simplest of tasks. They never handed me any responsibilities, treating me like a volatile explosive ready to go off at any second. Whenever any decision was made regarding our lives or the household, I was explicitly and deliberately excluded from the conversation. The agonizing difference between my life and Clara's life became most apparent during their lavish social events. At every gala, charity dinner, or holiday party, my parents would enthusiastically pull Clara to the center of the room, beaming with absolute joy as they introduced her to their wealthy friends as the pride of the family. If a prominent guest happened to notice me standing awkwardly in the corner and asked who I was, my parents would wave a dismissive hand, lower their voices, and introduce me merely as the rather complicated older daughter. The most maddening part of this entire 25-year ordeal is the utter betrayal of my own memory. I genuinely do not have a clear recollection of the night the fire actually happened. When I close my eyes in the dark and try to force the memories of my 8-year-old self to surface, all I get are terrifying, disjointed flashes that make my heart race. I remember the suffocating smell of thick black smoke filling my lungs. I remember the piercing sound of people screaming, echoing through the burning hallways. And I clearly remember the desperate, bruising grip of my mother's hands as she forcefully pulled me out of the burning house and into the cold night air. That is it. That is all I have to rely on. But my father never allowed any room for doubt or questions. Whenever I dared to question the events of that night, he would look down at me with absolute, terrifying authority and firmly state, "You are the one who did it." Hearing that exact sentence repeated like a dark mantra for years takes a devastating toll on your sanity. Eventually, my own mind surrendered to the relentless pressure, and I began to truly believe that his version of events was the undeniable truth. This miserable, stagnant existence might have continued forever, a quiet tragedy hidden behind expensive curtains, if it weren't for a sudden, massive shift in the family's ambitions. We're currently bracing for a huge event that has the entire household in an absolute frenzy. Clara, the golden child who has never done wrong in their eyes, is officially stepping into the public arena to run for city mayor. It is a ruthless, high-stakes campaign, and for her political run to be flawless and successful, the family and her PR team agree that they must wipe away every single scandal from our past. And in their ruthless, calculating eyes, the absolute biggest scandal this family has ever had to endure is me. The family made their decision swiftly, coldly, and entirely without my input. My mother came into my room yesterday, her posture rigid and her face an unreadable mask, and delivered the final verdict. "You should leave the city for a few months," she said, her voice devoid of any maternal warmth. When I asked her why, demanding at least a shred of honesty after 25 years of obedience, she didn't hesitate to deliver the crushing blow. "The press doesn't need to know you exist," she explained flatly, standing there, listening to my own mother say those words with such ease. The reality of my situation finally hit me like a physical blow. It was the very first time in my 33 years that I truly recognized the terrifying depth of their perspective. My family didn't just harbor a deep-seated hatred for me because of a fire. They actively, desperately wanted to completely erase me from their history. To them, I wasn't a daughter who made a tragic mistake. I was a political liability, a ghost they needed to exorcise before the camera started rolling and the voting booths opened. The days following my mother's command to leave the city were a blur of packing and silent resignation. I was actually going to do it. I was going to quietly pack my bags, slip out the back door of the only home I had ever known, and disappear into the background, so Clara could have a shining moment without the family's biggest scandal-ruining things. Fighting back was a muscle I had never been allowed to develop, and retreating felt like my only option. But exactly 3 days before my scheduled departure, my phone rang with an unknown number. I normally wouldn't answer, but something inexplicable made me pick up the call. The voice on the other end was calm, steady, and entirely unfamiliar. "Lena Hartwell? My name is Samuel Gray, and I am an investigative journalist." The man said that I hung up the phone immediately. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. An investigative journalist? Now, the timing couldn't possibly be worse. If my controlling father found out a reporter was sniffing around our family history right in the middle of Clara's mayoral campaign, he would completely destroy me. I blocked the number. I spent the next 24 hours looking over my shoulder, terrified that the Samuel Gray would somehow materialize and ruin my quiet exit. Samuel contacted me multiple times over the next few days, but I initially refused to speak with him. I wanted absolutely nothing to do with reporters or digging up the past, but Samuel Gray was clearly not a man who gave up easily. The next afternoon, as I was walking out of a quiet coffee shop on the edge of town, one of the rare places I went to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the Hartwell estate, he was simply standing there, leaning against my car. He didn't look like a threat. He looked exhausted, holding a worn leather briefcase, wearing a wrinkled trench coat. He held his hands up in a peaceful gesture as I instinctively backed away. "Please, Lena, just give me 5 minutes," he said, his voice level and unbothered by my obvious panic. "I am currently researching the fire that happened 25 years ago, and I found something in the official records that simply doesn't make any sense." I shook my head violently, feeling the old panic rising. "I have nothing to say to you. I don't remember anything from that night. My family has suffered enough because of me. Please, just leave us alone." I reached for my car door handle, desperate to get inside. "You couldn't have done it," Samuel said loudly, his words cutting sharply through the chilly afternoon air that I froze. My hand stopped dead on the door handle. I turned slowly to look at him, my brow furrowed in extreme confusion. For 25 years, I had been told by everyone who mattered that I was the monster who burned our lives down. No one had ever suggested otherwise. My guilt was the absolute, unquestioned truth of the Hartwell household. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I said you couldn't have started that fire, Lena," Samuel repeated, taking a deliberate step forward. "I have the original fire department reports, and I have evidence that changes everything. The fire didn't start from a knocked-over candle or a child playing with matches. It started down in the basement because the industrial gas system in your house was manually opened." I stared at him, my mind struggling violently to process the words. "So, what does that mean?" Samuel pulled a neatly folded piece of paper from his pocket, handing it to me. "According to the official records and basic mechanics, an 8-year-old child physically cannot open an industrial gas system. That specific commercial valve requires a massive amount of continuous rotational torque to open. It is a heavy mechanism designed for adult factory workers. Lena, you were a tiny 8-year-old girl. You physically did not have the body weight, the grip strength, or the leverage required to pry open that system. It is scientifically and mechanically impossible for you to be the person who caused that fire." The paper in my trembling hands was a copy of an old inspection report, filled with dense technical jargon and diagrams of gas lines. I couldn't read a single word of it because my eyes were filled with blinding tears. I felt a terrifying mixture of shock and a deep, rising anger pooling in my stomach. Was he lying to me? Was this an elaborate trick by a desperate reporter looking for a juicy political scoop? But looking up at his face, I saw only honest sincerity. When he presented this undeniable physical evidence, my entire perspective began to change that I finally agreed to sit down with him at a rundown diner a few miles down the road. I desperately needed to get away from my car, away from anywhere my family might have eyes. We sat opposite each other in a faded vinyl booth in the dim back corner, the strong smell of cheap coffee and greasy food grounding me in reality. Samuel carefully opened his briefcase and laid out an array of old documents on the sticky table. "I've been digging deep into the Hartwell family history, and the fire is the unavoidable turning point," Samuel explained, keeping his voice low. "The official story fed to the public has always been that a tragic accident caused by a careless child was to blame. That's exactly what my father told the police," I said quietly, staring blankly at my hands. "That's what he told the insurance company. That's what he told me every single day for the rest of my miserable life." "I know," Samuel said gently, "but the math doesn't work. The physics don't work." When I realized the glaring discrepancy with the gas valve, I started digging much deeper into the house's infrastructure. "Did you know your house was equipped with a high-end security camera system?" I looked up, genuinely surprised. "I don't remember that at all." The official police report states that the system's data was completely wiped clean. The convenient explanation provided by your father was that the intense heat of the fire destroyed the servers in the basement. "Is that not what happened?" I asked, catching the deliberate skepticism in his tone. Samuel shook his head slowly. "Someone intentionally deleted the data before the fire even reached that server room. The system was wiped." I felt an icy chill run straight down my spine. The noisy diner around us seemed to instantly fade away. The clattering of plates and the murmur of other customers disappeared entirely from my awareness. "Someone wiped the cameras? Why would anyone do that?" Samuel leaned forward, his eyes locked intensely onto mine. "Because there was another person in that room, Lena." Samuel discovered that on the night of the fire, there was an adult in the gas room. He pulled one final photograph from his battered briefcase and slid it slowly across the table toward me. It was printed on fresh, glossy paper, a stark contrast to the yellow documents we had been examining. The person who wiped the security system was thorough, but not completely perfect. Using modern digital forensics, I managed to recover a small part of the deleted data. I looked down at the photograph. It was incredibly grainy, dark, and heavily distorted with thick digital artifacts. But right there, in the very center of the frame, standing near the massive metal pipes of the gas system, was a figure. The blurry image clearly showed a human figure. "That is absolutely not an 8-year-old girl," Samuel said quietly, pointing a steady finger at the blurry figure. "The physical proportions are entirely wrong. That is a full-grown person. We know for a fact that it is not you." I couldn't breathe. The stale air in my lungs felt exactly like thick, suffocating smoke, mimicking the brief, terrifying flashes of memory I still had from that night. My hands shook so violently that I had to drop the photograph onto the table before I tore it. For 25 agonizing years, I had fully accepted my assigned role as the villain of the Hartwell family. I had bowed my head, absorbed the daily emotional abuse, and believed with every fiber of my being that I was inherently broken, toxic, and destructive. I had allowed them to hide me away in the shadows, to treat me like a repulsive stain on their perfect lives, all because I truly thought I deserved the punishment, but I didn't. I was innocent. I was just a little girl. "Who is it?" I whispered, my voice cracking painfully under the crushing weight of a quarter-century of entirely misplaced guilt. "Who is in that picture?" Samuel carefully gathered the scattered documents, leaving only the blurry photograph resting on the table between us. He looked at me with a complex mixture of profound pity and absolute, unwavering resolve. "I don't know yet, Lena. The recovered image is currently too degraded to identify the face right away. But we know it's an adult. We know it was an inside job. And we know, without a shadow of a doubt, that someone in your own family has been lying to you and to the police for 25 years. I sat there in the dimly lit diner for a very long time after Samuel finished speaking. The core foundation of my entire reality had just been violently, irrevocably shattered. The people I lived with, the very people who were currently forcing me to pack my bags and flee the city to protect their shiny political ambitions, were hiding a monstrous, unforgivable secret. They didn't just hate me for a tragic childhood mistake. They had actively, maliciously framed me for a crime I didn't commit. As I sat there staring down at the blurry figure in the photograph, a new, entirely unfamiliar feeling began to wash over me, quickly replacing the decades of ingrained fear and blind submission. It was anger. Hot, sharp, and entirely justified anger. I wasn't going to pack my bags and leave the city quietly anymore. I was going to find out exactly who was in that basement. The anger that ignited inside me at the diner did not fade when I walked out into the cold evening air. For 25 years, I had been completely convinced that my sheer existence was a curse on my family, but now I had a blurry photograph of a grown adult standing in our basement just moments before the house went up in flames. I told Samuel Gray that I was not going to pack my bags and disappear quietly so my sister Clara could have a perfect, scandal-free mayoral campaign. I needed to know exactly who was in that basement, and I needed to know why they let an 8-year-old child take the fall for a quarter of a century. Samuel took me to his cramped, incredibly messy apartment across town, which served as his makeshift investigative office. The walls were covered in printed articles, timelines, and financial charts related to my father's company, Hartwell Industries. It was entirely overwhelming to see my family's private history pinned up like a crime scene board, but I forced myself to look at it. Samuel handed me a mug of black coffee, his expression dead serious, as he pulled up the recovered digital forensics on his laptop. He explained that whoever wiped the security cameras was smart, but they were rushing, leaving behind fragments of data deep in the system's hard drive. "We already established that the figure in the gas room is an adult, not you," Samuel said, tapping the screen where the dark, heavily pixelated image of the person was displayed. "But finding out who this is requires looking at the motive. Why would an adult intentionally open a heavy industrial gas valve in their own home?" I stared at the screen, my mind racing. "To destroy something," I replied, the answer coming to me surprisingly fast. "If you want to burn a house down that badly, you want to make sure nothing survives." Samuel nodded slowly, bringing up a new window on his computer. "Exactly. And to understand what they were trying to destroy, we have to look at the exact state of Hartwell Industries 25 years ago. The public narrative is that the tragic fire almost pushed your father's company into bankruptcy because of the immense emotional and financial toll it took on the family. That is the story he sold to the press, the investors, and his wealthy peers." Samuel clicked a button, and dozens of scanned documents filled the screen. They were old bank statements, internal audits, and aggressively worded letters from creditors. But that is a complete lie, Lena. The company was not pushed to the brink of bankruptcy because of the fire. The company was already completely bankrupt before the fire even started. I leaned in closer to the screen, reading the dates on the financial documents. They were all dated just weeks and days before the fire. I don't understand, I said, feeling a heavy knot form in my stomach. My father is a brilliant businessman. He has always been obsessed with financial dominance and control. How could the company be bankrupt? Because 25 years ago, Edward Hartwell was committing massive, systematic financial fraud within the company, Samuel stated plainly, his voice dropping an octave. He was embezzling funds, doctoring the internal accounting books, and making highly illegal investments that completely tanked. The authorities were getting close. An independent audit was scheduled for the exact week after the fire happened. I felt all the blood drain from my face. The room suddenly felt freezing cold. The fire, I whispered, my voice trembling uncontrollably. The fire wasn't an accident. It was a cover-up. Yes, Samuel confirmed, pulling up a detailed blueprint of our old house. Where did your father keep all the physical servers and the hard copy financial records for the company back then? In the basement. I replied instantly, the memory flooding back with absolute clarity. He had a massive home office down there, right next to the utility rooms. He said he liked to work late at night without waking us up. He intentionally started the fire to completely destroy those financial records, Samuel explained, drawing a red circle around the basement area on the blueprint. He manually opened the industrial gas system, letting the room fill with gas, and triggered the ignition. The fire wiped out every single piece of evidence of his massive financial fraud before the auditors could ever find it. I had to sit down on Samuel's worn-out sofa. My legs simply stopped working. My father, the man who constantly told me that everything would be better if I didn't exist, was a criminal. But it didn't just stop at destroying the records, did it? I asked, looking up at Samuel with tears stinging my eyes. There was something else. The insurance, Samuel said softly, handing me a thick file folder. Your father had taken out an absolutely massive, comprehensive insurance policy on the property and the business assets housed inside it just 3 months prior. The insurance payout from the fire was astronomical. That massive influx of cash is exactly what saved Hartwell Industries from going under. He used the insurance money to secretly pay off his bad debts and rebuild the company's finances from scratch. I flipped through the insurance claim documents, seeing my father's neat, sharp signature at the bottom of every page. He had planned the entire thing. He had calculated the exact risk, the exact payout, and he executed it flawlessly. But as I sat there, absorbing the horrifying reality of his greed, a dark, terrifying realization hit me. The fire got too big, I said, my voice barely audible in the quiet room. It got completely out of control. Yes, Samuel agreed, a grim expression on his face. Opening an industrial gas line is incredibly dangerous and unpredictable. The explosion was much larger than he anticipated. It spread through the entire house in minutes. It nearly killed your entire family, and it severely injured one of your relatives, leaving them with permanent damage. The police and the fire investigators were crawling all over the property. The public was watching. He needed a perfect, airtight excuse for how the fire started without drawing any attention to the basement's gas valve or the destroyed financial records. Samuel walked back over to the laptop and maximized the blurry, recovered image of the adult figure standing in the basement. He ran a final enhancement program that he had been processing in the background. The thick pixels slowly smoothed out. The shadows adjusted. And suddenly, the figure in the photograph was no longer just a nameless adult silhouette. The posture, the distinct tailored suit, the custom luxury watch gleaming on the wrist under the dim basement lights, it was absolutely undeniable. It was Edward, Samuel said, confirming the horrifying truth. Your father is the person in the photograph. I stared at the image of my father, Edward Hartwell, standing in the basement, preparing to burn our lives to the ground. He was the one who committed the massive financial fraud. He was the one who intentionally started the fire to destroy the records and collect the insurance money. And when things violently spiraled out of his control, when the police started asking hard questions, he did the most unthinkable, unnatural thing a parent could possibly do to save his own reputation, he pointed his finger at his tiny, innocent, 8-year-old daughter, and he firmly told the world that I did it. For 25 years, I had carried the excruciating weight of his sins. I had endured the relentless emotional abuse, the endless whispers at social events, the cold, unforgiving stares from my mother, and the quiet, arrogant pity from my perfect sister Clara. I had let them treat me like a repulsive stain, an unwanted burden, a volatile monster who destroyed our family's happiness. And my father had simply watched it happen. He sat at the head of the dining table every single night for a quarter of a century, watching me break under the weight of his guilt, knowing perfectly well that he was the monster. He destroyed my entire life just to save his business. I whispered, the hot tears finally spilling over my cheeks and dropping onto the insurance documents in my lap. He threw me to the wolves so he wouldn't have to go to prison. To save his reputation, he did the unthinkable, Samuel said quietly, sitting down next to me. He blamed an 8-year-old child. The profound betrayal was a physical pain, a sharp, twisting knife directly in my chest. It wasn't just that he lied. It was the deliberate, sustained cruelty of maintaining that lie for decades. Every time he looked at me and said, "If you didn't exist, everything would have been better," he wasn't expressing anger over a tragic accident. He was projecting his own deep, rotting guilt onto me. He hated me because looking at me reminded him of exactly what he had done to survive. That I wiped the tears from my face, taking a long, shaky breath. The terrified, submissive Lena, who had agreed to quietly leave the city just a few days ago, was officially dead. The fire inside me now was completely out of control, and this time I wasn't going to take the blame for it. I looked at Samuel, my hands balling into tight fists. We had the motive, we had the financial documents, and we had the photograph of him in the basement. But I knew my family. I knew exactly how ruthlessly they operated to protect their precious image. "My father will not go down easily, Samuel," I warned him, my voice finally steady and cold. "He has millions of dollars, the best lawyers in the state, and a massive network of powerful friends who will do anything to protect him. If we go to the police with just this, he will find a way to bury the evidence. He will claim the photograph is doctored. He will say the financial records are fake." Samuel leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. "You're right. Edward Hartwell is entirely too powerful to just hand over to the local authorities. If we want this to stick, if we want to ensure he can't buy his way out of this, we have to do exactly what he fears most. We have to destroy his public reputation." I nodded, a dangerous, bitter smile slowly forming on my lips. Clara's mayoral campaign. The family has spent millions trying to make sure her image is absolutely flawless. They were going to forcefully exile me from the city just so I wouldn't ruin her chances of winning. My father's entire ego is currently wrapped up in getting Clara elected and expanding his political influence. "Exactly," Samuel agreed, his eyes lighting up with absolute determination. "We don't just take this to the police. We take this to the press. We blow this wide open right in the middle of her campaign. We show the entire city exactly who the Hartwell family really is." We sat there in the dim light of his apartment, surrounded by the undeniable proof of my father's monstrous betrayal. For the first time in my 33 years of life, I didn't feel like a broken, complicated mistake hiding in the shadows. I felt powerful. The truth was finally in my hands, and I was going to use it to burn their perfect, manufactured world to the ground. The drive back to the Hartwell estate was the longest commute of my entire life. My hands gripped the steering wheel, so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white, but my mind was sharper than it had ever been. Tucked safely inside my leather bag were the copies of the financial documents and the heavily enhanced photograph of my father, Edward Hartwell, standing in the basement gas room 25 years ago. Samuel and I had a solid plan to take this explosive information directly to the press, but there was one thing I desperately needed to do first. I needed to look my mother in the eye. For my entire life, Margaret Hartwell had been the ultimate enforcer of my psychological punishment. She was the one who controlled my every single move, who isolated me from the rest of the world, and who consistently looked at me with such profound, withering disappointment that it made my bones ache. I truly believe that once I showed her the undeniable proof of what her husband had done, She would finally realize that she had spent 25 years hating the wrong person, that I walked through the massive double doors of our home, entirely ignoring the confused look from the household staff, and marched straight into my mother's private study. She was sitting perfectly straight behind her heavy mahogany desk, carefully reviewing expensive catering lists for Clara's upcoming mayoral fundraising gala. She didn't even bother to look up when I entered, merely sighing in open annoyance at the sudden interruption that I didn't say a single word. I simply walked up to her desk, unzipped my bag, and threw the folder down right on top of her pristine event planning notes. I watched her perfectly manicured hands pull the documents out. I waited for the shock. I waited for her eyes to widen, for the sudden, horrifying realization to hit her that the powerful husband she worshipped was actually a desperate criminal who had framed her innocent 8-year-old daughter. But the shock never came. My mother slowly looked at the damning financial records, her expression completely flat and unchanged. Then, she picked up the glossy photograph of my father in the basement. She stared at it for a few long seconds, completely unfazed, before neatly sliding it back into the folder. She folded her hands tightly on the desk, looking up at me with eyes as cold as absolute ice. "Where did you get these, Lena?" she asked, her voice completely devoid of any emotion. That I froze. My breath hitched painfully in my throat. She wasn't surprised. She wasn't angry at him. She was only annoyed that I had my hands on the documents. You aren't surprised," I stammered, my heart beginning to pound a terrifying rhythm against my ribs. "You see that it was him, right? He manually opened the gas valve. He started the fire. He committed the fraud. Do you understand what this means?" "I have always known exactly what it means," my mother replied smoothly, her tone eerily calm. "I knew the moment the police started investigating the basement 25 years ago. Your father told me everything that exact same night." The lavish room started to spin. The air was suddenly too thick to breathe. "You knew," I whispered, my voice breaking completely under the weight of her words. "You knew he did it? You knew I was completely innocent?" "Of course I knew you were innocent, Lena. You were 8 years old," she said, leaning back in her expensive leather chair as if we were casually discussing the weather. "But your father had made a terrible financial miscalculation. He was facing federal prison. The company was going to be completely liquidated. We were about to lose this house, our status, our money, our entire place in society. The police needed someone to blame for the fire, and your father needed a distraction. The family had to be protected, at absolutely any cost." That I stumbled backward, hitting my shoulder hard against the heavy oak bookshelf. The second massive twist of my life hit me with the force of a speeding train. It wasn't just my father who had sacrificed me. The betrayal was infinitely deeper and far more malicious than I could have ever possibly imagined. My own mother, the woman who brought me into this world, had actively agreed to keep the monstrous secret. She had looked at her tiny, terrified daughter and consciously decided that my total mental destruction was a perfectly acceptable price to pay to keep her luxury cars and exclusive country club memberships. She had enthusiastically participated in my daily psychological torture for a quarter of a century, knowing every single day that I had done absolutely nothing wrong. Before I could even process the sheer horror of her confession, the heavy oak door of the study swung open. My younger sister, Clara, walked in, wearing a sharp, custom-tailored suit, completely absorbed in her phone. "Mother, Victor just called and said the polling numbers in the Southern District are—" Clara stopped mid-sentence, finally noticing the thick, suffocating tension in the room and the horrified, tear-streaked look on my face. She looked down at the folder resting on our mother's desk. I saw her eyes briefly lock onto the corner of the photograph sticking out, and a flash of nervous recognition crossed her perfectly powdered face. "What is she doing in here?" Clara asked sharply, her voice immediately taking on that familiar, condescending tone she always used with me. "I thought you told her to pack her bags and leave the city so we could focus on the campaign." I looked at Clara, my perfect, golden child sister. The genuine panic in her eyes when she saw the folder gave her away instantly. She wasn't just annoyed by my presence. She was terrified of what was sitting on that desk. "You know too," I said, my voice barely a breathless whisper. "Clara, you know about the fire." Clara stiffened. She looked directly at our mother for help, but Margaret simply gave her a tight, confirming nod. Clara let out a long, frustrated sigh and aggressively crossed her arms over her chest, immediately dropping the perfect, friendly politician persona. Yes, Lena. I know, Clara admitted coldly, not even having the basic human decency to look ashamed. I found out a few years ago when I started doing deep background checks for my political run. I saw the sealed insurance documents and forced Dad to tell me the truth. And you chose to keep quiet? I asked, tears of pure, unadulterated rage finally spilling hot down my cheeks. You watched them treat me like a monster. You treated me like a disgusting burden, knowing the entire time that Dad was the one who did it. What exactly did you expect me to do, Lena? Clara snapped back, her voice rising in defensive anger. Go to the police, ruin our father's life, ruin my own future. Do you have any idea how hard I have worked to build my flawless reputation? If a massive financial fraud and arson scandal came out, my political career would be completely over before it even started. My husband's career would be destroyed. The Hartwell name would be absolute garbage. I chose to stay silent because it was the only logical thing to do. And I stood there in the center of the luxurious study, surrounded by the three people who were supposed to be my family, feeling entirely alienated from the human race. They were monsters. All of them. My father had lit the match to save his own skin. My mother had happily buried the truth to protect her bank account. And my sister had actively chosen to keep me locked in my miserable, guilt-ridden hell just so she could win a local election. They had all collectively looked at me and decided that my life simply did not matter. The suffocating sadness that had defined my existence for 25 years instantly evaporated, completely burned away by a sudden, intense clarity. I didn't feel broken anymore. I didn't feel confused. I felt incredibly dangerous. You are all completely sick, I said quietly, my voice eerily steady. I walked back over to the desk, completely ignoring the warning glare from my mother, and snatched the folder back. I carefully zipped it into my bag, making sure the precious evidence was secure. Lena, put those documents back right now, my mother ordered, her voice finally losing its calm facade and cracking with genuine, desperate authority. You are not going to ruin this family. You are going to go upstairs, pack your bags, and leave the city exactly as we instructed. No, I replied, looking directly into her cold eyes. I am not going anywhere. For 25 years, you made me believe that I destroyed everything. You made me hate myself. You made me wish I was dead. I turned to look at Clara, who was now visibly shaking with rising panic. And you let it happen so you could play the perfect daughter. I turned my back on them and walked purposefully toward the heavy study door. I didn't care about their wealth, their power, or their pathetic, manufactured public image anymore. I had the absolute truth safely in my bag, and I had Samuel waiting for my call. The Hartwell family was finally going to burn, but this time, it wouldn't be a fake accident in the basement. It was going to be a massive, uncontrollable public inferno, and I was going to be the one holding the match. Walking out of my mother's private study felt exactly like stepping out of a suffocating, airless grave I had been trapped inside for 25 years. I didn't bother going upstairs. I didn't pack a single bag or collect any of my belongings. I just walked straight out the massive oak front doors of the Hartwell estate, got into my car, and drove directly back to Samuel Gray's messy, paper-filled apartment across town. When I walked through his door and dropped the folder of evidence onto his desk, my hands were shaking violently, but my mind was completely and terrifyingly clear. I told him everything that had just happened with my mother and Clara. I explained how they had known the entire time, how they had actively, willingly participated in my lifelong psychological torture just to protect their precious bank accounts, their luxury cars, and their flawless public image. Samuel listened quietly, his jaw clenching tighter and tighter with every word I spoke. When I finished my story, he didn't offer any empty platitudes or fake sympathy. He simply opened his laptop, pulled up his final draft, and looked at me with absolute resolve. Samuel was actively preparing to publish the investigative article. However, the process of taking down a powerful, highly connected billionaire like Edward Hartwell wasn't as simple as just hitting a button on a blog. Samuel explained that as a professional journalist, he was legally and ethically required to reach out to the subjects of his investigation for an official comment before the story went live to the public. It was the ultimate professional courtesy, a warning shot directly across their bow. Sitting on his worn-out sofa, I watched as Samuel drafted a formal email to my father's massive public relations team and his elite corporate lawyers. The email briefly outlined the irrefutable evidence we possessed: the heavily enhanced photograph of my father standing in the basement, the hidden financial documents proving his massive corporate fraud, and the insurance records that provided the undeniable, sickening motive. Samuel gave them exactly 24 hours to respond before the story would hit the front page of every major news outlet in the city. He took a deep breath, and he hit send that we didn't have to wait 24 hours. We barely had to wait 24 minutes. Almost immediately, the fallout began. The Hartwell family completely panicked. My phone, which had been blissfully silent since I drove away from the estate, suddenly erupted into a relentless, buzzing frenzy of calls and text messages. First, it was my mother, leaving frantic, uncharacteristically breathless voicemails demanding that I come home immediately so we could discuss this rationally like a family. Then it was Clara, whose perfectly curated, friendly political texts rapidly devolved into hysterical, angry threats about massive lawsuits and completely ruining my life. They were entirely terrified. The carefully constructed fortress of lies they had built over 25 years was violently crumbling around them, and they realized they had absolutely no control over the person holding the sledgehammer. I ignored every single call from my mother and sister. But then, a text message flashed across my screen from a number I hadn't seen in my recent history. It was from my father. It was incredibly brief, completely devoid of his usual arrogance and chillingly direct. "Come to my corporate office. Right now. We need to end this." Samuel aggressively warned me not to go, arguing that Edward Hartwell was a desperate, dangerous man who was currently cornered by his own monumental lies. He said men like my father do terrible things when their backs are against the wall. But I knew I had to do this. I needed to look the man who had stolen my entire childhood directly in the eye, not as the terrified, submissive 8-year-old girl he had callously framed, but as the grown woman who was finally going to hold him accountable. I drove to the towering glass skyscraper in the center of the city that housed the headquarters of Hartwell Industries. For my entire life, this massive building had been a monument to my father's immense power and my own crushing inadequacy. But as I confidently rode the private, glass-walled elevator up to his penthouse office, I didn't feel small anymore. I felt like the executioner. My father met with me one last time. When the heavy glass doors of his office slid open, I was genuinely shocked by his physical appearance. Edward Hartwell, the man who was always immaculately dressed, perfectly composed, and terrifyingly in control of every room he entered, looked completely haggard. His expensive silk tie was violently loosened, his perfectly styled hair was entirely disheveled, and the deep, dark bags under his eyes betrayed the sheer, unadulterated terror he was currently trying to hide. He was standing behind his massive mahogany desk, gripping the edge of the wood so tightly his knuckles were turning white. The room was deathly quiet. There were no lawyers present, no PR representatives trying to spin the narrative, no assistants taking notes. It was just him and me, the monster and his chosen scapegoat. "Lena," he said, his voice completely lacking its usual booming, authoritative resonance. It sounded thin, desperate, and incredibly old. He slowly walked around the desk, stopping just a few feet away from me. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing. You are being manipulated by a desperate, third-rate reporter who just wants to make a name for himself by taking down a highly successful man." "I'm not being manipulated by anyone, Dad," I replied, my voice completely steady, a stark, powerful contrast to his nervous energy. "I saw the photograph. I saw the financial records from 25 years ago. I know about the massive corporate fraud. I know you manually opened that industrial gas valve. I know you burned our house down to destroy the evidence. And I know you blamed me so you wouldn't have to spend the rest of your pathetic life in federal prison." He flinched. It was a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, but I saw it, the undeniable truth hitting him directly in the face. But instead of apologizing, instead of falling to his knees and begging for the forgiveness he so desperately needed from me, Edward Hartwell immediately reverted to the only tactic he knew: aggressive, shameless manipulation. "Do you have any idea what will happen if that article goes live?" he demanded, his voice slowly rising in volume. desperately trying to regain his lost authority and control over me. Hartwell Industries will completely collapse. Thousands of people will lose their jobs. The family's bank accounts will be entirely frozen. Your mother will be publicly humiliated in front of everyone she knows. Clara's mayoral campaign will be instantly destroyed, and her political career will be entirely over before it even starts. He took a step closer, his eyes narrowing into cold, hard slits, trying to use the exact same paralyzing intimidation that had kept me silent and obedient for a quarter of a century. He looked at me and firmly stated, "You will completely destroy the family if you do this." That I stood there, looking at the man who had provided the DNA that ran through my veins, and I felt absolutely nothing but profound, hollow pity. For 25 years, that exact threat would have brought me straight to my knees. The mere thought of causing the family any more pain was the heavy, suffocating chain that had kept me obediently locked in my dark corner. But the chain was already broken. He had broken at the moment he let Samuel's blurry photograph exist. I didn't back away. I didn't lower my gaze. I stepped directly into his space, forcing him to look at the exact face of the innocent child he had ruthlessly sacrificed for his own greed. "Who destroyed it first?" I asked him, my voice dropping to a deadly, quiet whisper. The question hung heavily in the sterile, air-conditioned air of his massive penthouse office. It wasn't just a rhetorical question. It was the final, devastating verdict of a 25-year trial. I watched the remaining color completely drain from his face. His mouth opened slightly, but absolutely no words came out. He had spent his entire life building incredibly complex corporate defenses, hiring the absolute best lawyers money could buy, and spinning flawless public relations narratives, but he had absolutely no defense against the raw, undeniable truth of what he had done to his own daughter. He had destroyed our family 25 years ago in the dark basement of our home. He had lit the match. I was just the one finally calling the fire department, and I didn't wait for him to formulate a pathetic, lying response. I turned my back on Edward Hartwell for the very last time, leaving him standing entirely alone in the suffocating silence of his crumbling empire. I walked out of the glass doors, stepped back into the elevator, and pulled out my phone. I sent a single, 2-word text message to Samuel Gray. "Publish it." The drive from my father's towering corporate headquarters back to Samuel Gray's apartment was a blur. My hands were finally steady on the steering wheel, and for the first time in 25 years, I was not looking over my shoulder, waiting for a punishment I did not deserve. I walked into Samuel's messy living room, my phone completely turned off and buried at the bottom of my bag. Samuel was sitting at his desk, staring intensely at his laptop screen. He looked up when I walked in, reading the absolute certainty on my face. I didn't need to explain what had happened in Edward Hartwell's penthouse office. I simply nodded. Samuel turned back to his keyboard, took a sharp breath, and pressed the button. The truth was finally out of my hands. The investigative article officially went live on the internet exactly at noon. Samuel had chosen a very direct, undeniable headline that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation or PR spin. "The Hartwell fire 25 years ago, the blamed child." We sat in the quiet apartment and watched the analytics on Samuel's screen. At first, there was nothing but a slow, steady trickle of readers. But within 20 minutes, the link was picked up by a major local news aggregator. Then, a prominent political commentator on social media shared it, heavily tagging Clara's mayoral campaign accounts. From that exact moment, the trickle turned into an absolute, unstoppable tsunami. Samuel had meticulously structured the article so that it was impossible to deny. He didn't just write a sensational story, he published the actual, undeniable receipts. He uploaded the scanned financial records, proving my father's massive corporate fraud. He included the technical specifications of the basement's industrial gas valve, clearly explaining the impossible physics of an 8-year-old child opening it. And most devastatingly, he published the heavily enhanced digital photograph of Edward Hartwell standing right next to that very valve minutes before the house exploded. The entire city was completely shocked. My family had spent decades meticulously cultivating an image of wealthy, flawless perfection, actively positioning themselves as the moral and financial pillars of the community. The revelation that the great Edward Hartwell was actually a desperate arsonist who nearly killed his own family to cover up massive corporate theft was a massive earthquake. But the detail that truly horrified the public The detail that made the story instantly go viral across the entire country was the undeniable cruelty of the scapegoat. The public was absolutely disgusted to learn that a powerful billionaire and his complicit wife had intentionally blamed their innocent 8-year-old daughter for a quarter of a century just to maintain their luxury lifestyle. The immediate, real-world fallout was spectacular and incredibly fast. Clara was completely blindsided. At the exact moment the article went viral, she was hosting a highly publicized, incredibly expensive campaign luncheon at a luxury hotel downtown, entirely surrounded by wealthy donors and local press. According to the live news feeds we were watching on Samuel's television, the atmosphere in the ballroom changed in less than 5 minutes. Reporters' phones started buzzing relentlessly. Donors began looking down at their screens, their faces dropping in absolute horror as they read the headline. The Hartwell fire 25 years ago, the blamed child, that a brave local reporter stood up right in the middle of Clara's polished speech about family values and loudly asked her to comment on the leaked documents proving her father burned their house down and framed her sister. Clara completely froze on live television. Her perfectly rehearsed political smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She stammered, frantically looked offstage for her PR manager, and then practically ran away from the podium. By the time she reached her waiting car in the alleyway, her mayoral campaign had completely collapsed. Major financial backers publicly pulled their funding within the hour. Her senior campaign staff resigned immediately, releasing statements to distance themselves from the radioactive Hartwell name. Even worse for Clara was the reaction of her husband, Victor Lang. Victor was a rising, ambitious politician who cared about his own public image above absolutely everything else. When the sheer scale of the scandal broke, and it became explicitly clear through the article that Clara had known the truth for years and actively helped keep me quiet, Victor didn't stand by her side. He immediately packed his bags, moved out of their shared penthouse, and had his own public relations team release a cold statement claiming he was horrified by the actions of his in-laws and was filing for separation. Clara lost her election, her husband, and her golden child status all in the span of a single afternoon. But the most significant consequence of the article was happening at Hartwell Industries. My father's arrogant belief that his money and power made him completely untouchable was officially shattered. You cannot publicly publish concrete evidence of massive financial fraud and arson without the authorities getting involved. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, local news helicopters were circling the massive glass skyscraper where I had just spoken to him. Edward was officially being investigated. We watched live footage as unmarked black vehicles pulled up to the front doors of the building. Federal investigators and local police officers, armed with emergency warrants based on the newly published financial and digital evidence, marched directly into the corporate lobby. They were seizing computer servers, locking down his financial accounts, and freezing the company's assets. The 25-year-old case of the Hartwell family fire was officially reopened, and this time, the police were not looking at an 8-year-old girl. They were looking squarely at the billionaire and the penthouse MY mother, Margaret, faced a completely different, but equally devastating kind of justice. She wasn't the one who manually opened the gas valve, but her eager complicity in my torture made her a massive target for public outrage. The elite, wealthy social circles she had sacrificed my entire life to stay a part of completely turned their backs on her instantly. Her exclusive country club memberships were revoked by the end of the day. The charity board she sat on aggressively demanded her immediate resignation. Her phone, which usually rang constantly with invitations to galas and high society dinners, went completely dead. She was permanently locked inside the massive, empty Hartwell estate, surrounded by news vans parked entirely across her perfectly manicured lawn, completely isolated from the world she worshipped. I sat on Samuel's old sofa, watching my family's perfect, manufactured empire violently burn to the ground on every single news channel. My phone, still sitting at the bottom of my bag, was completely silent. They couldn't reach me anymore. They couldn't control the narrative, and they certainly couldn't blame me for the absolute destruction of their lives. For 25 years, they had successfully convinced the entire world that I was a volatile monster who destroyed everything I touched. But as I watched the news anchors dissect the cold, hard facts of my father's crimes, the truth was finally, undeniably clear to everyone. I didn't destroy the Hartwell family. The Hartwell family destroyed themselves, and I was just the survivor who finally decided to stop keeping their monster secrets. The days immediately following the publication of the article were a chaotic blur of breaking news alerts, endless media speculation, and the absolute destruction of the Hartwell family empire. Sitting quietly in the corner of Samuel Gray's cramped apartment, I watched the entire city react to the shocking revelation about the fire that happened 25 years ago. The television screen was constantly filled with images of my father, Edward Hartwell, being investigated by the authorities for the massive financial fraud he committed. The news anchors relentlessly discussed how Clara's mayoral campaign had completely collapsed overnight. They talked endlessly about how my mother had known the terrible truth all along and had deliberately agreed to keep the secret just so the family could be protected. And of course, they talked about me, the 8-year-old child who was ruthlessly blamed for everything. Most people in my situation might have felt a massive sense of victory or a deep, satisfying thrill of revenge watching their abusers finally face public ruin. But as I sat there watching the empire burn down, I did not celebrate. There was no cheering, no smiling, and no triumphant phone calls to the people who had wronged me. I just felt an overwhelming, heavy exhaustion settling deep into my bones. For 25 long years, my entire existence had been completely defined by a lie. From the time I was a little girl, every single argument in that massive house was blamed entirely on me. Every single failure my family experienced was my fault, and whenever anything bad happened, the immediate reaction was always that I had caused trouble again. They had treated me like a destructive force, a shameful stain on the family name, keeping me around only as a convenient, living reminder of their own failures that I spent hours staring out the small window of the apartment, processing the sheer magnitude of what my family had done to me. I thought about my father, a man so incredibly selfish and desperate that he intentionally caused a fire to destroy his financial records and collect insurance money, only to point his finger at his tiny, innocent daughter when things got out of control. My father used to look me right in the eye and coldly say that if I did not exist, everything would have been better. Sitting there, I finally understood the sickening irony of his favorite insult. If I had not existed to take the blame 25 years ago, he would have gone straight to federal prison, and the family would have lost absolutely everything right then and there. He used my existence as a human shield to protect his wealth and his ego, and then he spent decades punishing me for it. I thought about my mother, who looked at me every single day with cold disappointment, fully knowing that I was entirely innocent, but choosing to participate in my psychological torture anyway. She allowed me to grow up completely isolated, ensuring that no one ever trusted me or gave me any real responsibilities. I thought about Clara, the perfect sister who was always introduced at lavish parties as the pride of the family, while I was pushed into the shadows and introduced merely as the complicated older daughter. Clara had eventually learned the truth too, but she actively chose to stay silent just to protect her own flawless reputation. They had all collectively looked at me, an innocent child, and decided that my sanity and my life simply did not matter as long as their public image remained intact. Samuel eventually walked over to the window, handing me a fresh cup of coffee. He asked me how I was feeling, expecting me to be either ecstatic about the public vindication or completely devastated by the finality of the family's betrayal. I took a slow sip of the coffee and looked at the television screen, where a news reporter was currently standing outside the locked gates of the Hartwell estate. I turned to Samuel and told him exactly what was in my heart. I told him that I do not need them to love me. I realized in that quiet moment that I had spent my entire adult life desperately seeking a tiny shred of validation or affection from people who were fundamentally incapable of giving it. I had accepted their daily abuse because I thought I deserved it, because I truly believed I was the monster who had destroyed our family 25 years ago. But I wasn't a monster. I was just a convenient scapegoat for a household of criminals and cowards. I did not need their apologies, I did not need their money, and I certainly did not need their love. I only needed the truth. Having the truth finally out in the open was the only thing that mattered to me now. The thick, suffocating fog that had clouded my mind for over 2 decades was finally gone. I no longer had to wake up every single morning feeling that heavy, crushing weight of misplaced guilt pressing down on my chest. I no longer had to question my own disjointed memories of the smoke and the screaming, wondering if I was inherently broken and evil. The truth was out there, verified by undeniable evidence, and no amount of money or public relations spin from my father could ever put it back in the dark basement where it started. Later that evening, I made a final decision about my future. Weeks ago, when the family was frantically preparing for Clara's political run, my mother had rigidly ordered me to leave the city for a few months. She had coldly told me that the press did not need to know I existed, and that they wanted to erase the family's biggest scandal from their history completely. I was finally going to grant her wish, but entirely on my own terms. I packed a small bag with the few essential things I needed, leaving behind the designer clothes and the expensive jewelry that were bought with dirty Hartwell money. I was going to leave the city. When I walked out of Samuel's apartment and got into my car, the night air felt entirely different. It felt clean, crisp, and incredibly light. As I drove toward the highway, watching the bright city lights slowly fade in my rearview mirror, I knew perfectly well that I was not running away. Running away is what guilty people do. It is what my father tried to do by blaming an 8-year-old child for his massive financial crimes. It is what Clara tried to do by running away from the podium when the reporters started asking hard questions about the scandal. I had nothing left to run from, and I had absolutely nothing left to hide. The truth had already set me entirely free that I drove onto the interstate, leaving the city, the scandals, and the toxic Hartwell legacy far behind me. I was stepping into a completely unknown future, but for the very first time in my 33 years of life, I wasn't terrified. I was leaving specifically to start a new life that no longer carried the heavy, suffocating guilt of someone else's horrific mistakes. I didn't know exactly where I was going, or what I was going to do next, but I knew that I was finally just Lena. For the first time ever, my life belonged entirely to me, and that was more than enough. The morning sun broke over the horizon as I kept my hand steady on the steering wheel, putting more and more miles between myself and the only home I had ever known. The radio was playing softly in the background, periodically interrupted by the top-of-the-hour news bulletins. Even hours away from the city, the lead story remained exactly the same. The reporters were still relentlessly dissecting the absolute downfall of Edward Hartwell and the shocking end to Clara's political ambitions. Listening to strangers discuss the intricate details of my family's massive web of lies felt completely surreal. For 25 years, those secrets were the heavy chains that kept me locked in a dark, suffocating corner of that massive estate. Now, those same secrets were public property, broadcasted to millions of people over their morning coffee that I pulled over at a small, run-down diner on the side of the highway, a place that my mother would have absolutely despised. The neon sign outside was flickering, and the parking lot was mostly empty except for a few long-haul trucks. I walked inside, sat at a sticky vinyl booth in the back corner, ordered a cheap cup of black coffee, and looked at the television mounted above the counter. The news channel was showing live footage of federal agents carrying dozens of heavy cardboard boxes out of the Hartwell Industries headquarters. My father's corporate empire, the very thing he had sacrificed my entire childhood to protect, was systematically being dismantled piece by piece. The screen then cut to a brief, chaotic clip of my mother, Margaret. She was aggressively shoving her way past a massive crowd of local reporters parked outside the family estate. Her perfectly powdered face was twisted in pure, unadulterated rage as she refused to answer any of their shouted questions, desperately trying to hide behind her expensive designer sunglasses, seeing them like that, stripped of their manufactured perfection, completely exposed to the harsh light of public scrutiny, and entirely powerless to control the narrative, should have made me feel a massive wave of triumph. After all, these were the exact people who had intentionally subjected me to a quarter of a century of psychological torture. They had stolen my childhood, shattered my self-worth, and convinced the entire world that I was a dangerous, volatile monster. But as I sat there in the quiet diner watching the inevitable, explosive consequences of their own horrific actions unfold on the screen, I did not celebrate. There was no cheering in my heart, no smug satisfaction, and absolutely no desire to pick up my phone to call them and gloat. The fiery anger that had fueled me through the initial, terrifying investigation with Samuel Gray had completely burned itself out, leaving behind nothing but a profound, quiet clarity. The waitress came by to refill my chipped ceramic mug, offering a warm, genuine smile that felt completely foreign compared to the cold, calculating expressions I was so entirely used to seeing at the Hartwell dinner table. I smiled back at her, realizing just how incredibly simple normal human interaction could actually be when it wasn't layered with decades of resentment and hidden agendas. For my entire life, I had desperately craved the basic approval of my parents and my perfect sister. I had contorted myself into whatever quiet, submissive shape they required, silently taking the blame for every single thing that went wrong in their miserable lives, all because I fundamentally believed that if I just endured enough punishment, they might eventually show me a tiny shred of affection. I wanted them to look at me the way they looked at Clara, with pride instead of absolute disgust, but sitting in that roadside diner, watching my father's legacy crumble into dust on a cheap television screen, I finally understood the absolute truth. I did not need them to love me. The realization washed over me like a wave of pure, refreshing ice water, instantly clearing away the last remaining traces of my childhood insecurities. I had spent 33 years trying to earn love from people who were entirely incapable of giving it, people who value their bank accounts, their luxury cars, and their flawless public image far more than the life and sanity of their own daughter. I realized that their love was completely worthless anyway, built on a rotting, unstable foundation of lies, manipulation, and immense cruelty. I only need the truth. And the truth was finally out there, permanently etched into the public record, completely verified by Samuel Gray's undeniable evidence, and entirely impossible for my family to ever deny or erase again that I left a cash tip on the table, walked back out into the bright morning sunlight, and got back into my car. I turned the key, merged back onto the long, open highway, and pressed my foot down on the gas pedal. I was officially leaving the city. I had no specific destination in mind. No grand, detailed plan for what my career or my future would look like. I didn't know where I would sleep tomorrow night or what kind of job I would eventually find. All I knew was that I had to keep moving forward, putting as much physical distance as possible between myself and the toxic, suffocating gravity of the Hartwell family name. I knew that my mother and Clara would probably spend the rest of their miserable lives desperately trying to spin the narrative, blaming the reporters, blaming the political opponents, and maybe even still trying to blame me in their own twisted, heavily distorted minds. But it simply did not matter anymore. Their harsh words and cold glares had completely lost their power over me. When my mother had originally commanded me to pack my bags weeks ago, she had coldly assumed I would be running away in shame, quietly disappearing into the shadows so I wouldn't ruin Clara's polished mayoral campaign. But as I drove down the interstate, feeling the steady hum of the engine beneath me and the warm sun on my face, I knew with absolute, unwavering certainty that I was not doing this to run away. Running away implies fear. It implies that you have a dark secret you are desperately trying to hide, or that you are terrified of facing the entirely justified consequences of your own actions. My father was the one who ran away. He ran away from his massive financial fraud by cowardly opening an industrial gas valve and setting his own house on fire. Clara ran away from the podium when the reporters started asking her the hard questions she couldn't answer. I had absolutely nothing to run from because I was the only person in that massive house who had actually told the truth. I was leaving to start a completely new life. It would be a simple life, a quiet life, but most importantly, it would be an honest life. It would be a life where I didn't have to constantly look over my shoulder, waiting for the next cruel accusation to be hurled in my direction. It would be a life where I could make normal, everyday mistakes without being immediately told that my sheer existence was a curse that destroyed everything I touched. For 25 years, I had carried an excruciatingly heavy burden that was never, ever mine to carry in the first place. But as the highway miles rolled by, the air in the car felt lighter and lighter with every passing minute. I was finally stepping into a bright, entirely unknown future where I was no longer carrying the guilt of others. I am Lena, just Lena, and for the very first time in my 33 years on this earth, that is exactly who I want to be.